Hey, what's going on, guys? Today I wanted to go over Sayrn, since it seems like they have come to a stopping point, at least for now, on her rework, and I personally think that she's in a good place. I'll give a brief overview of her abilities. I want to go over how I built her and why, and then I'll play some gameplay footage and go over different options and ways you can build Sayrn now after the rework, and just give my basic thoughts. So starting out, I want to go over Saryn's abilities and how they work, especially because of the recent changes, just to make sure you know how they function as I go farther into the video. Her one is her main ability. It's her spores, which on the initial cast place 3 spores on an enemy. The attached spores take for corrosive damage, and you are able to spread them to other enemies as well. Spores spread in 3 main ways: by shooting the spores, by killing the enemy, or by having Toxic Lash active while damaging an enemy. For each spore that is triggered, it transfers to all enemies within your spread radius and reapplies the spore to the target you have just damaged. It is for this reason that Toxic Lash is so good, and I'll talk about that later on during the gameplay section. Her 2 is her Molt. This essentially leaves a decoy that looks like this and gives you a small speed increase for its duration, depending on your power strength. Now this ability is largely useless other than the fact that the augment, called Regenerative Molt, heals you as well, also based on power strength. And I use Regenerative Molt in most of my Sayrn builds. Now our third ability is called Toxic Lash. This ability applies toxin damage to all of your weapons. So you can see here, when I cast it, my Tiburon Prime now has this little toxin effect, so you know that it's being affected. The main function for this, other than the damage boost, is that when casting spores on an enemy, you don't need to shoot the spores themselves or kill the enemy in order to propagate the spores with Toxic Lash. So I have Toxic Lash up, I shoot the enemy, it propagates to everything. Even though I did not hit a spore, it's still transferred to all enemies. And last but not least, Saryn's 4 is Miasma. This ability does a guaranteed viral proc on all enemies within its range and deals some damage over time to them as well. So as you can see here, all these enemies have been affected by my miasma and are taking small damage procs. I'll talk about the different synergies and go more in depth into each ability during the gameplay section of the video. But I'm hoping that if you aren't familiar with Saryn's abilities, this has at least given you a working knowledge of them. But for now, let's look at my build. Alright, so this is my current Sayrn build. I'm basically just going for max range, and then I've added some survivability and duration onto that. The way this is currently built now, I'm missing Augur Reach. The reason for that is I substituted in Regenerative Molt. I think that losing 30% ability range is probably worth having the extra survivability with the augment. Without this augment, Molt is pretty useless, and this allows you to regenerate health whenever you cast Molt and scales with power strength, which is quite nice, especially if you're playing solo or having some difficulty surviving in general, which is something that Sayrn is not particularly good at. Other than that, I have some ability strength with Blind Rage and Transient Fortitude, just to get me up to about 200%, which gets spores to an almost 100% status chance and gives you a good amount of damage. I'll talk about my decision making here a little bit more during the gameplay footage. Vitality is a mod I run on pretty much just every warframe because it increases your base health, and that's just better than shields or armor for your overall effective HP. And if you're just running one survivability mod in a warframe, then I'd recommend that to be Vitality. I have Prime Continuity here to help a little bit with my ability duration, especially since Transient Fortitude reduces that, and I essentially just want positive ability duration. And I'm running Streamline over Fleeting Expertise, because I don't want to lose that extra duration. I really enjoy having over 100%, and I'll talk about that more again during the gameplay. And then I have Overextended to increase my ability range, pretty self-explanatory. Cutting Drift again for ability range, and then I'm running Corrosive Projection here, simply because I think it's more useful than something like Growing Power. Even though that does increase your ability strength, that's not the most important thing on Sayrn at the moment. And if I wasn't using Corrosive Projection, I would almost certainly be using something like Energy Siphon, especially because Sayrn does struggle a little bit with energy costs, especially using Regenerative Molt, which is why, as you can see over on the right, I'm running an Arcane Energize and Guardian. I realize that not everybody's going to have Arcanes, but I wanted to show off what I was using currently. The Guardian is for just basic survivability to give me armor. And the Energize is, again, to help with overall energy efficiency. The other build I go for Sayrn is a Miasma build that focuses on you casting Miasma over and over again. I use this in places like Hydron if I want to carry, although you could use it elsewhere to reduce all enemy health by half by just continually recasting it, or kill enemies in lower level missions. And I essentially just go for maximum efficiency while also getting a little bit of range and power strength. And I have the prime continuity here simply to keep my duration from being almost non-existent, because without duration the miasma ticks don't last long or at all in some cases. And I also have Energy Siphon here and Arcane Energize again to help with energy costs. But that does it for the build overview, so I'm going to play some gameplay in the background and talk a little bit about my decision making for the normal Sayrn build. For this footage I decided to do a solo queue in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught to showcase both the build's power, and I chose solo simply because Sayrn still struggles with some groups, especially in Onslaught where there's multiple Sayryns. And if you have more than one Sayrn in the game, you might as well just leave, because having two Sayryns is really counterproductive to your effectiveness as Sayrn. And the reason for that is enemies can only have 3 spores total, and if there's another Sayrn casting their spores, then they'll take up spore slots on enemies, and you just won't do damage. But for this, I basically just keep up Toxic Lash, and then I recast spores as needed. While you're playing Sayrn, really don't be afraid to recast your spores. If you need to create a new target to propagate them, you will lose a little bit of damage, but recasting them is not really going to hurt you that much in the long run. And by doing it, you're going to be able to affect many more enemies. So if you're under the 10 enemy limit, which means that you are affecting less than 10 enemies, 10 being the cap for the number of enemies that will increase your spore damage, then you're not gaining damage as quickly as possible. So recasting it on one enemy and spreading it to 10 more can be very useful. And since they changed the spores to propagate on the first target's death, it makes it really easy to cast and then spread spores even if that target dies immediately, which can happen depending on what your damage is ramped up to. The other thing I want to talk about is power strength here. You'll notice that I don't go for a maximum power strength build, and part of that is because range is so good at spreading spores as far as possible and killing as many targets as you can, but also because once you scale your damage to a certain point, you'll hit a soft cap, depending on the health of enemies, where they will be dying faster than you can gain increased damage, and that number will go up the longer you play into something like Sanctuary Onslaught, where the enemy level scales. And I'm also using Regenerative Molt on this build, because survivability as Sayrn is pretty rough, and I do think I died maybe once or twice while filming this footage, which will be less of an issue if you have some teammates around. But for this, since I was solo, it was a little difficult to survive easily, even with Arcane Guardian. But maybe if you're a better player, or you're just paying a little bit more attention, you won't really have that issue. Keeping Toxic Lash up is definitely the most important thing for spreading spores efficiently. You can kill your targets, but it's much easier to cast Toxic Lash and spread them that way, especially because Toxic Lash will detonate all 3 spores and transfer 3 spores to all the surrounding enemies every time you hit a target, whereas shooting a spore will only transfer 1 spore at a time. It really is the best way to propagate your spores around, and because it affects primary and secondary weapons, you can simply cast and shoot them from a distance, and it will spread them within your radius. My radius isn't the largest, but because I don't mind recasting and spreading that way, I'm not too worried about having the maximum range. I still get a good coverage in my testing, but if you prefer the other way, don't be afraid to change the build up for yourself. As far as your weapons go, you can really use almost anything. It's just about you surviving and being able to recast your spores for the most part. And if there's a weapon that helps you survive longer, then I would suggest using that. The other thing you could do is run something like Natural Talent to increase your cast speed on spores if you want to cast them a lot. It also does help with other casting animations, but definitely not necessary. And in my experience, Sayrn has a big enough natural energy pool where you don't need something like Flow or Prime Flow, especially since you're essentially casting Toxic Lash and leaving it up. and then occasionally casting spores or regenerative molt if you are low on life. And the longer your duration is, the less you're going to have to cast and the less the energy cost will be. I do recognize in this footage that I'm using a Scoliac with a range riven, which is, not something everybody's going to have, but a good primary weapon or maybe an Atarax will achieve similar results with just a little less range. The Scoliac here is just helping me survive more than it is killing the enemies, because it is difficult to survive solo as Sayrn, since she's not the tankiest frame, which is why I think having that regenerative molt instead of the extra range is really useful. I've really enjoyed the Saryn 3.5 rework, and I'm hoping you guys are having as much fun as I am. But I think that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed and maybe learned something. And if you did find it helpful, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe for future content. I am thinking of doing more Warframe videos like this, where I go over a Warframe and its potential builds, or at least the ones that I'm using. So if you want more of these, please let me know.